Hello and welcome to part 10 of my video series on how to use Blender 2.7. In this video, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the cycles render engine in Blender and how to add materials to objects in Blender and how to add multiple materials to objects in Blender. Let's start off though by talking about the old Blender render engine versus the new cycles render engine. If you watched the earlier videos in this series, when we set up Blender, you'll remember that I asked you to change the default renderer up here from the old Blender render engine to the new cycles render engine. The reason why that is because of the way that these two render engines draw scenes. Now let's back up a little bit. What is a render engine? I'm going to flip back over to the old Blender render engine. A render engine is the way in which your 3D program draws out the scene with things like considerations for lighting and materials and shadows and bounce lighting and the way that materials interact and lights interact with materials in a scene. If I press render under my camera tab in this properties window, you probably know by now that if you click it, it draws out the scene from the perspective of the camera that's in your scene. I'm going to go ahead and quickly add a new mesh plane to my scene and scale it up to be a ground, and I'm going to move my cube up so that it's sitting on the ground. I'll press render again using the Blender render engine, and you'll notice that the reason why this Blender render engine is kind of fading into the distance or the distant memory of Blender is that it's very old and antiquated in the way that it calculates the way that light bounces. You'll notice that this shadow area is entirely black, and that's not how light would be, or that's not how light interacts with a scene in the real world. In the real world, if you have a light, it will bounce off objects and illuminate the shadow areas of other things in the same space. That's where the cycles render engine is very powerful. It calculates light in a very realistic way, and that's not how the old Blender render engine could have done it. We're going to talk about lighting more in the next video, but what I'll do is I'll press escape and I'm going to go back over to the cycles render engine, which is where we're pretty much going to stick for the rest of this whole video series. And if I press render again, you do get the shadows filled in, but because the lamp in the scene is not set up to work with cycles very well, the scene is way too dull. Let's talk about that for a sec. I'm going to select my lamp with the cycles render engine enabled up here, and I'm going to go to the tab for this lamp, and again, when you have different objects selected, you will get different tabs up here. When you have a lamp selected, you get the lamp tab, and you're going to see a few things here. The size of this lamp is 0.1. That means that it's very, very small, and we can't even have access right now to how bright the lamp is, like we could have if we were in the old Blender render engine. And that's because these lamps are sort of the not best way to add light into your scene. The new way of adding light to a scene, I mean, you can use these ones, is by making an object and making that object into a light source, like a real object would be, like a light bulb, or the filament in a light bulb would be in the real world. So I'm going to get rid of this lamp. I'll select it and tap X on my keyboard and click on delete. I'm going to add a new plane to my scene, and I'll drag it up, and we're going to make this material, or make this object, have a material that will emit light. Now, another thing with the cycles render engine is that it's very different adding materials to objects. It's very simple to add just a plain old material to an object. You have the object selected, you go to the materials tab, which looks like an orb, and you click on new. What that will do is it'll add a new slot into this area here, and the slot contains the material that you just added. You can have multiple materials on the same object in different slots, which is why it's important to name materials as soon as you add them. Material.001 is not a very good name, so I'm going to change it to light with an I, source 1, and I'll press enter. So right now though, I can't even see a preview of it. In the old Blender render engine, there would have been a kind of an orb or a shape that I picked that would let me see what it's like, And there is one here, it's just sort of collapsed by default. I'm not sure why they did that, but here it is. You can pick what kind of object you want to see it on. By default, it's a sphere. Now the material that we added, and this is always true, is what's called a diffuse material or a diffuse shader. This kind of diffuse texture means it only has color. There is no shininess, there is no mirroredness, there is no bumpiness or any other property. It's just a color that has a shadow and it doesn't glow or do anything like that. To make this material have a different kind of a shader, you can change the surface value, which gives you a list of the default shaders that are built into Blender. The one that we want to add is called emission, and what emission does is it emits light. When you change it to emission, you'll see that it turns entirely white, and that's because the color right here is white or almost white, so you can drag the shade up and down to the shade that you want, in this case white, and you can even pick a material or a material color, which I'm going to make kind of like a tungsten lamp, like a light bulb, which is a little bit orange. And I'll move my mouse away, and now you can see it's a little bit that color. The cool thing is that right now this is actually going to emit light when we render the scene. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. I'm going to click on the render tab and click on the render button. And now you can see there is now light casting onto the scene, and there's a shadow on the bottom of my cube on the ground. The light's way too dull though, so I'll press escape, and I'll go back to the material tab, and I'll change the strength of this light or this material up to a higher value, let's say 10, and I'll press enter. But I'm not going to keep going back to this render tab to render. In fact, I'm not even going to press F12 if that is possible on your keyboard. I'm going to go down here to the shading display menu or the viewport shading menu and change the type from solid to rendered. Now, before I do that though, I'm going to split my window in two by grabbing this little triangular area and pulling down. And now I'll change this window to have rendered shading. And as you can see, and this is a new feature with cycles, you can use it with the old Blender render engine now, but originally it came to be with the cycles render engine. You can see your scene in real time. Now when you change the view as you're seeing, it kind of gets all grainy, and then it kind of solves itself down to a certain point, but you can see what is happening in your scene. The reason why I made two windows is that in this window I can do all my editing and I can see what's happening in real time. So if I want this lamp to be bigger, I can select it and scale it up, and as you can see, because it's a bigger surface, it's emitting more light and my scene is getting bigger. Now, this is not how we will render our scene. We will not just change a viewport. We will actually still use the camera tab and the render button to make our final movie when it's time for that. But just know that this is a handy tool to use to see what your scene looks like. Now what I'm going to do is go to my front orthographic view, and I'm going to make this light source a little bit smaller, and I'll rotate it and I'll move it. Now you'll notice you can see the light in your scene, so I'm going to keep it off the edge right there, and we're going to kind of zoom in on the shadow, and as you can see, because this light source is the size that it is, we have a shadow that looks like that. Larger light sources, if I scale this up and I turn down the strength, let's change it maybe to 2, larger light sources make softer shadows. That's one of the principles in photography or cinematography. If you think back to when you had your picture taken in the first week or two of school, you'll know that they used probably big lights or big shiny umbrellas to reflect light from a lot of different, or from a large area, and that's so that you didn't have really harsh shadows under your eyes or on the sides or bottom of your nose. That's why big lights are often advisable. If I have a very small light, and I'll turn it way up so you can see what it looks like, maybe to 100, I have much harder shadows, and they can get even harsher than that, maybe even 200. So it's up to you, but just keep that in mind. The purpose of this video is not to talk about lights though. Let's get on to materials. I'm going to select my cube in the middle of the scene. In fact, I'm going to get rid of my cube, and I'm going to add the monkey head. The monkey head's there, and her name is Suzanne, so that we can play with lighting and materials. So I'm going to rotate it so it's sitting on the ground. So I'll move it up on the Z-axis, and maybe I'll rotate it R and then Z so it's facing this angle right there. So right now this monkey head, in fact, what I'll do is I'll add the subsurf modifier to make it all nice and smooth, and I'll click on my smooth shading to make it all nice. This monkey head probably doesn't have a material. Let's go check. With it selected, I'm going to go to the Materials tab. So we're going to make it have a few different types of materials, and I'm going to show you how to make and combine materials using what's called a mix shader. So I'll click on New. It's added a new slot to this material, and we're going to name it. So I'm going to name this Matte Material 1 and press Enter. Now it has a diffuse shader again, and we talked about that when we first added our light. What that means is a material that's just flat, there's no shininess. I'm going to give it a color, so there it is. And if I want to make parts of the monkey a different color, let's say I want to make the monkey's eyes red, what I need to do is I need to make a new slot in this section which will hold another material. And notice that when I switch objects, this list goes away. So what this area contains is a list of materials in slots of the materials that are on the currently selected object. So to make a new slot, I'm going to press plus. Everything goes away because there's now a new slot with no material on it. I'm going to press New, and I'm going to name this material Glossy Material 1. Gloggy. Great. Glossy Material 1. And instead of picking a diffuse shader, I'm going to pick a glossy shader. And what that means, it's right near the top, is a material that's almost a mirror. Now you can pick kind of a color of the mirror in the color options down here. So I'm going to make this mirror very red. And you'll see there is a delay in this window, but it's fairly responsive. And if I want to make it, reflective but not entirely a mirror, I can change the roughness of it. Now the roughness does not mean it becomes bumpy. It just sort of softens the mirror effect. So you can see this is now, it has a highlight on it because of light, but it's only slightly mirroring the things in the scene. If I turn that down more, it'll become more like a mirror. If I turn it all the way up to 1, it goes from 0 to 1. It becomes a little bit specular, but again, almost like a diffuse material or a diffuse shader. I'm going to make it right about, let's type in a value instead. Let's go to 0.15. So it's fairly reflective. Let's go even lower than that, 0.05. Whoops. 0.05. There we go. So it's quite reflective, although a little bit not. Now I want to apply this to the monkey's eyes. I have two materials that are associated with this object, but this material has not been applied to anything. So I'm going to go into my monkey head's edit mode by pressing tab. I'll go to face select mode, and I'm going to select all of the faces on each one of these eyes. Now these eyes, if I go into wireframe display mode, that's with the Z key, or you can change it right here. If you look at these eyes, they're actually separate objects or separate sub-objects. They're not actually connected to the other parts of the head. So what I can do is with my mouse over one of the eyes, especially over one of the dots of the faces, I can press L on my keyboard, and that stands for island. And if you have an island, which is a separate part in a mesh, that's an easy way to select it. So again, put your mouse over one of the dots and tap on L for island. And I want to apply this glossy material to this eye. So I'll select it and click on Assign. If you look down here now, my eye now has, or my monkey has one evil glossy looking eye. I will apply it to the other eye as well. So I'll press A to deselect all, and then L to select that island, and click on the glossy material and click on Assign. So now my monkey is looking fairly menacing, although I kind of want the blue of the monkey head to be a little bit glossy. Not entirely mirrored, and not totally flat, but I want to have sort of the best of both worlds. It should have an underlying color of blue, but then maybe a different color of specular or highlights where it would be reflecting the light source in the scene. To do that, to combine materials together, and this is where you get into very advanced materials. If you think of a amusement park ride that has cars in it. You probably went on one of these when you were little. And you look down at that glossy material on that car or plane at the amusement park, you probably noticed that it was very glossy. It had a color underneath, let's say red, but it also had a bunch of speckles underneath it that were reflecting lights in different ways. That's a very complicated multi-surface material, and that's where we have to get into what's called using nodes in Blender. Now, nodes are a different way of thinking of making materials. What I'm going to do is actually split this top window in two, and we're going to make a new window called a node editor window. So I'm going to change this window type right here to a node editor. And with the monkey selected and with the glossy material selected, you can kind of see what nodes are. They're kind of a visual way of seeing the different parts or different aspects of a material. And this material, this glossy, is very simple. It only has one shader, which is this box right here. It is a glossy BDSF, same thing that's down here, shader. And it has a material output, which actually allows you to see it on an object. If you zoom out by scrolling down this window, you have a lot of space, in fact, pretty much infinite space, in which to make very complicated shaders or materials by combining shaders and different elements together, or different nodes together. If I look at this matte material, it's almost exactly the same. There is a material output and a diffuse shader, and they're connected. And this is, again, sort of a visual way of representing ways of combining things, kind of like filters in Photoshop or GIMP, filters like drop shadow and filters like stroke and gradient. You could think of adding those to a picture using nodes like this. It's a very similar concept, but represented differently visually. I'm going to change the material on my monkey, so I'm going to actually click on this X to delete the material out of that slot, which will leave that blank slot there and no material on my monkey, and I'm going to click New. And what that does is it kind of loads a default diffuse shader, but I don't want a diffuse shader, I want a mix shader which combine multiple things into the same material. So instead of selecting diffuse, I'm going to select mix, and let's see where it is, right there. Now with a mix shader, it's not actually its own surface. Right now it's black because it doesn't know what to do, there's no actual material. But the mix shader gives you options to add two shaders within the same material. So what I'm going to do, and you're going to see what's happening up here with nodes, I'm going to add a diffuse shader as the kind of the first material, like it's applied to the object. So we're going to add a diffuse material. And you can kind of see I can collapse that first one or expand it with that little plus or minus. I'm going to pick a material. This time it's going to be a green monkey. And again, I can pick the roughness of this material. And I'm not really sure what that does. I guess it makes it less even and less happy to disperse light over its surface. You can see the highlights and the shadows get pushed towards the outside, the rougher you go, and the more matte look it becomes, or it looks. The less rough, the more even and smooth the whole object looks. But we still have one more shader we can add. I'm going to combine a diffuse shader with a glossy shader, right there. And you can see the results in real time down here, the entire time, by the way. And this glossy shader has basically an almost white specular value, but you know, normally a green object wouldn't have a white specular, at least not unless it's very intense from a white light. So I'm going to change the color to just a slight green. And then I'll move my mouse away. And as you can see, now we have, you know, an object that's not entirely shiny and not entirely dull, but a mix of the two. And I can adjust the factor of how much matte versus how much shiny using this factor amount. So I can slide it up and down to make it entirely matte again, or entirely shiny again, and entirely mirrored, or somewhere happy in between. What's going on in this nodes editor window though? Well, these two materials actually overlap, so I'm going to drag them around. What we did here is directly on the material we added a mix shader. That was the first thing that we did. So we have our two basic nodes, the kind of uppermost material on the object, which required inputs, which is on this side of the node, from two materials, or at least from one, but it accepts two. And one we added a diffuse shader, and one we added a glossy shader. Now, you don't even have to use this area over here. Once you add a new material to an object, once you click on that new button, you can start working immediately in here. I'm going to delete these two nodes, so I'll select one by right-clicking on it, and I'll tap X, delete it, and I'll delete this one, and I'll even delete this one as well. So now we only have a material output, which is how the material looked when we first added. In fact, what I'll do is I'll get rid of that slot entirely. Actually, no, I want to undo that. I'm going to get rid of the material in that slot entirely to start from scratch, and this will be the last part of this video. I'm going to click on New to add a new material into that slot, and again our monkey looks like it's a default material, but instead of having a diffuse shader, I'm going to get rid of this one, and I'm going to use my Add menu, or Shift A, to add a shader that's a mix shader. So there it is, it's attached to my mouse, but I want to plug it into the surface of the material output. So you can see there's always inputs and outputs on most materials. I'll connect these two. So now it knows that, or the material knows that it's receiving a mix shader. The mix shader now needs, again, two shaders to be inputted to actually give the object a surface or a material. So I'll press Shift A again, and I'm going to add a diffuse shader. So I'll click right there, and Shift A again, I'll add a glossy shader right there. Again, we have to connect them from the output to the input, and now we can pick our colors and roughness and the factor all in this window. This is a very scary, and in fact I was very scared to start working with nodes when I first saw them come up in cycles, and to tell you the truth, I've avoided them as much as I can, but they are easy to use once you understand what's going on, especially when you start simple. Now, as I explained with that whole carnival ride, glossy, specular car surface, you can get very, very complicated setups of nodes, and in fact there are a way of grouping nodes in this window, but we're just going to start very simply. I'm going to make the color of my diffuse green again, and I'm going to make the color of the specular part just a little bit green, and then I will combine them using the factor again. So let's make it very glossy, and I don't want it to be that rough, so I'm going to make it quite mirrored, and maybe make it more mirrored than not. Again, the scene would be more interesting if there were more things in the scene for the monkey head to reflect, but right now there's just a gray world and basically an off-white material. Let's go ahead and select this ground plane, and that's the last thing we'll do. I'll add a new material to it. I'm going to call it floor, and we're going to make this floor mirrored as well. So I'll add a glossy shader, and I will turn the roughness all the way down. And as you can see now, we have a very interesting and scary looking scene in our viewport. That's going to be for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.